Hi guys, I thought it might be helpful to create a video on how to prepare for resining your acrylic pour canvases. This is really intended for beginners, so if you've done a few resin projects, you probably know all of the tips I'm going to share. Again, I do want to be clear that this is about preparing, not the actual resining. There are tons of videos out there already that you can access, and I'll actually share my favorite at the end. So let's get started. Alright, so we're going to start with phase one, which is preparing your canvas to be resined. So obviously if you have used any silicone in your acrylic pour, you are going to want to clean the canvas. So I know that a lot of people will use baby powder or flour or some sort of powder to absorb the silicone. I personally just use Dawn dish soap and it works fine for me. Obviously, if you are cleaning your canvas and you're going to use water, obviously, to wash it down, you will want to make sure that your canvas is completely dry before you resin. Water and resin do not mix together. Also, if you have a larger canvas, even though it might have a wooden support in the middle, I do recommend that you add some additional cardboard to the back to reinforce the canvas. Resin is quite heavy, and so what happens is it creates sort of a dent in the canvas because of the weight of the resin, and all of the resin will puddle in the middle of the canvas. You'll also want to flip the canvas over and tape the edges. And so this just really helps with those pesky resin drips that obviously will happen no matter what. And then you will want to elevate your canvas. I use regular size push pins. I know a lot of people will use those very large push pins. You can use cups, you can use lids, whatever it is, just make sure that they are all the same height. So phase two is to prepare and think about the area that you're going to be working in. I actually use an elevated desk or stand-up desk to do my resin projects. I used to use a lower unit, and I just found that it was a bear on my back, and that's just absolutely no fun. It's already painful doing a resin project, let alone adding some backache to that. So just think about where you're going to be resining, whether it's at a desk, a table, on the floor, because you are going to be working on that project for about 45 minutes, so you do want to be comfortable during that time. It is very important to make sure that the area that you are working on, or the surface that you are working on, is level, and I check both the vertical and horizontal levels of the surface that I'm working on. I will also check the level of the surface, and then once I've placed my canvas on that surface, I will check the levels of the canvas as well. That just ties back to phase one. Whatever it is you're using to elevate your canvas, you need to make sure that those are level as well. And then obviously, no brainer, you're going to want to protect the area that you're working in, the surface that you're working on, and then also the floor surrounding you, especially for those of you who might be working in an area where you have carpet. I think if you're in a garage or your basement, you might not care so much. One little tip I will share with you, and something that I've started to use, is the non-skid padding. I found that when I was applying the resin to my canvases, because I had the plastic push pins and I was using plastic to protect the surface, the canvas was sliding around, and so I used the non-skid padding to avoid that. And then lastly, you will want to preheat the area, sounds like an oven, that you are going to be working in. I actually work in a small area, so I just have one space heater that I turn on in advance, probably about 30 minutes before I start the project. Obviously, if you're working in a larger space, you might need more heaters, or you just might need a longer time to preheat the room. And then also think about where you're working, whether it's in a basement or a garage, it might be a little cooler. So you do need the room to be at least 75 degrees or 22.222 Celsius or higher in order to be able to work with the resin. Okay, so now we are on to phase 3, which is thinking about all of the tools that you are going to use throughout the process. So what I like to do is sort of sit down and think end to end everything that I am going to need. The last thing you want is to be in a situation where you have resin all over your gloved hands and all of a sudden you need to go get something. It's just a nightmare. So this really is all around just being prepared and having everything that you need at hand. So starting with the basics, obviously you will need gloves. I do double my gloves. I use my one hand to spread the resin across the canvas, and so it's great to be able to then remove that glove once I'm done spreading the resin and be able to use that hand for either holding my torch or whatever else I might need. You will need some heat source, right? So whether that is a heat gun or a propane torch, you are going to need that to be able to burst the bubbles. Those are your enemies. If you are using a heat gun, which is what I use, you will want to make sure that it can reach the area that you are resining in. So wherever your canvases are, you might be resining more than one canvas at a time, and so you want to make sure that the gun will reach all of the canvases. So you might need an extension cord. If you use a propane torch, then obviously you're going to want to make sure that you have enough propane. You will need either a plastic container, if you can get your hands on a silicone container. They are the best to be able, you use that obviously to mix the resin in. Silicone just makes for an easy cleanup. You will also need a pretty sturdy stirring stick, and you'll also want to make sure that it's long enough for the container that you're using. And then you'll need either cups, or one cup that has a measuring scale on the side, or a digital scale to weigh both the epoxy and the hardener, which is what I use. Okay, so moving on with our tool prep. Obviously you will want something to spread the resin with. I actually use my hand, but I have seen other people use some sort of plastic spreader. You will want something to remove any of the imperfections, any dust or lint. In my case, I have 2 dogs, so magical dog fibers always get in the resin. So either toothpicks, I actually use one of those long wooden skewers. You can use tweezers. Some sort of a light. I use a handheld LED light. Think about this as a search and rescue. You've got to search for those little pieces of lint and dust and magical dog fibers, and you need to rescue them. So you will want some sort of light. It just helps you. I've seen other people use the light from their phone or a lamp. Reading glasses, another tip of mine. Even if you don't need them, it just helps with magnification, and again to be able to see some of those bits and pieces that you do not want in your canvas. Timer. You are going to want a timer. Generally you will need a timer twice. One to set the timer for when you are mixing both the epoxy and the hardener together, and that's generally about 3 minutes. You will also want to set the timer for how much work time you have. So for example, I use the Stone Coat Art Resin and I have about 45 minutes with which to work. So I set the timer a second time for that 45 minutes. I have seen people on YouTube, suddenly mixing the resin and working with the resin and then grabbing their phone to set the timer, or where they forgot to set their timer, use voice recognition, whether that's Siri, whether that's Google, whether Alexa. So, hey Siri, set the timer for 3 minutes.
Your timer is set for 3 minutes.
So much easier than, grabbing the phone and, run the risk of getting resin all over your phone. So that's that tip. And then also make sure that you have garbage bags close by, so that you can just throw the gloves that you no longer need, or any of the wooden skewers and things that you're using, and then wipes as well. They just help to clean any of the instruments that you're using. Alright, so just moving on to the last few things. Obviously you're going to want something to cover the canvases when you are done. I use lids from large storage containers, and then plastic cups to elevate those. Respirator and fire extinguisher. I really can't stress this enough. Make sure that you have both at hand, especially if you're using the propane torch. But regardless, you should have both in the room. Patience. You're going to need a lot of patience. One thing I didn't mention before, especially with the bubbles, you may have to run your heat gun or your propane torch across those canvases 2 or 3 or even 4 times during that working time period that you have. So again, in my case, 45 minutes. I tend to sort of step away at that 30-minute mark, and then come back like 5 minutes later and give it one more blast of heat. And then again, obviously, as I mentioned in the beginning, this video isn't about actually applying the resin itself. There are already so many videos out there about that, and the one that I would highly recommend is by Karen from Waterfall Acrylics. The video itself is just shy of an hour, but I cannot stress enough how amazing this video is. The amount of detail that she goes in was incredibly helpful for me. So if you are looking for that type of information, that is the one video that I would recommend, and I will link that video in the description box below. So let's just cover a few things post first coat of resin. So you are going to want to remove the tape that you applied approximately 18 hours after you resin. Again, it varies, and I think that's all really about the the temperature that you're working in. You want to get it before it's really hard, because it's just difficult to get the tape off. So you do want to be careful, because the resin will still be a little bit sticky. Another tip, if it is quite hard to get off, is to use either your heat gun or your propane torch or even a hairdryer, just to heat up the tape a little bit, and it makes it easier to peel it off. About 24 hours, I'd probably 48 to be honest with you, but until it's fully cured. You still, though, might find, even though you've used the tape, that there are still some resin that remains on the back of the canvas, so you will want to sand that off. You can either just do that by hand, you can use a palm sander or an orbit sander. And then the other day I actually saw somebody using one of those battery operated meant to use as a pumice stone, to get rid of the hard skin on the heel of your foot, that I know you can get in places like CVS or Walmart. But I thought that was actually a neat idea. One thing I will say, when you're doing that, I don't have it up on the screen here, is make sure that you're wearing your respirator when you sand the resin off the back of the canvas. You also might want to paint the back of the canvas just around the edges if it's really messy, if you do want a cleaner finish. I also add those little felt pads on each corner And you will most likely have to do a second coat of resin, especially with the canvases and especially with the gallery wrapped canvases. So I would wait at least 72 hours before you do that second coat of resin, and then you will want to just gently sand the first coat that you have applied. If you do have imperfections in the canvas, so if there's any lint or hair or anything or air bubbles, you just want to pay extra special attention to that and maybe sand those a little bit more than you would. But you do want to sand the entire surface, and use about 80 to 100 grit sandpaper should be fine. So that's it. I do hope that you guys have found this helpful, and see you soon. Bye.